All right, it's here. It's early. We are here to talk about Mr. Harrigan's Phone, the first story in the If It Bleeds collection. And we need to talk about Angelic Hitman today.
Oh, be careful. Careful who you piss off.
Welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una.
And I might be bleeding crypto.
All right, if you are new here, we don't do the usual reviews. We do more literary interpretations and discussions on this channel, where we try to bring the deeper meaning out of these stories and what they mean to us beyond just some of the general themes. So if you are down for that, please hit the subscribe button down below.
Publication on this, we got released a little bit early, which is pretty awesome. So it was supposed to be on May 4th, Happy Star Wars Day, and it got released April 21st, which is pretty awesome.
Now, some will argue that Stephen King's greatest strengths are in the short story and novellas, in terms of the body, in terms of Shawshank Redemption. And there's those that say that, his longer length novels like the Dark Tower series and It are where his strengths are. We'd love to know where you guys are. Let us know in the discussion down below. But for me personally, I really enjoy his shorter stories, I think. And I think he really did a good job with this piece.
I would agree. I think sometimes, though, it's a little bit subjective to what in particular story and book we're talking about. But overall, he seems to nail the endings in particular a little bit better with his short stories than sometimes the novels. But it can be hit or miss either way.
Quick housekeeping note, as I have seen some people talk about this is from a first-person perspective and from a young Craig's perspective. That is not correct at all. This is from older 25-year-old Craig's reflecting on younger Craig's perspectives. Unfortunately, it doesn't really matter, but I do want to be very specific here.
And also, we're going to be doing a read-along with Brad Proctor, so if you go and check out his channel, link will be down in the description below. Check out and see what he's saying about the stories as well.
All right, so in terms of how we do these, we typically do a plot, because sometimes people just check these videos out months later and they need a refresher. So we'll do a quick high-level plot. So if you're into spoilers or not into spoilers, now would be the time to click away. And then we're going to go into the discussion and talk about the deeper meanings. We'll put a link down below for the time codes to skip to if you want to skip ahead of the plot. But in 2020, Craig is reflecting back on 2004 Craig. Mr. Harrigan, a filthy rich tycoon, has moved to the small-time town of Harlow, Maine. Craig is soon hired by Harrigan to perform tasks that don't seem to be really needed. He saves his money to purchase a new iPhone, of which Mr. Harrigan kind of scoffs at the usage of technology, saying that every time we get a new device, we are beholden to it. Each year, Craig kind of gets these scratch and win tickets, and one day he wins big and decides to purchase a new iPhone for Mr. Harrigan. While resistant at first, once he starts to see the possibilities of how the operations of businesses will change, he accepts it and becomes enamored with using his new phone. Pretty soon, Mr. Harrigan dies, and Craig is the first one to find him and is unaffected by it. During the wake, Craig kind of puts the phone that he gave him in Mr. Harrigan's pocket so that Mr. Harrigan is buried with the phone in the ground. Now, Craig starts to experience some issues with a school bully, Kenny Yanko, and is kind of rescued by Mrs. Hargensen, who kind of becomes like a secondary mentor for him and kind of looks out for him. He's beat up at a school play or school dance. And Miss Hargensen discovers him and kind of ushers him, gives him some meds to make him feel better and ushers him off. But he finds himself starting to text. He also finds himself trying to channel Mr. Harrigan's philosophies and ways of life. And what's weird is he starts to get texts back from Mr. Harrigan. And mysteriously, one day, Kenny Yanko suddenly dies through a suicide. Craig continues to call Mr. Harrigan, which shouldn't be possible as the phone is buried in the ground and it should have lost its charge and not have reception at this point in time. So the story progresses, and eventually he learns that his mentor, Mrs. Hargensen, is killed by a drunk driver, and he finds out that that drunk driver was a delinquent, supported by old money. He kind of just gets off scot-free, pulls out the old phone because the new phone doesn't reach Mr. Harrington, but the old phone does. So he mysteriously dies, and he gets another mysterious text message from the Pirate King one, which Craig starts to realize that he's got an angelic hitman that's looking out for him with this text phone, right?
Yeah.
So in the end, he starts to kind of question some of the cryptic messages that he's getting and wonders is Mr. Harrington being tethered to this world through the phone, chucks the phone into the lake, kind of moves on with life from there. And that's kind of a high-level plot, mostly in order. I did it from memory, so I'm sorry if a couple things got switched, but...
So the first thing we talk about is technology. And here, obviously, that's the overlying theme. And we can go into some other stuff about that later. But why use this supernatural element to include technology in the story, I think, is a much more interesting question.
Yeah, Stephen King will spoon feed you on some things. Like, he gives you the lines and the reasoning and the theme with the technology. And you and I started to talk about this. And we started to talk about how would Craig's life have been different different had he never met Mr. Harrigan.
What different choices does Craig make, or what different path does his life take?
So he would have reacted differently with Kenny Yanko, right? Because at that point in time, he says to himself, what would Mr. Harrigan do? Right? He changes his own philosophy to try to act like this man, this mentor, this guiding figure in his life. And even very clearly his investment decisions in terms of having the money to be able to pursue a less lucrative career.
And so then this got us really talking about almost that idea of It's a Wonderful Life and how that story progresses and how your life can be drastically different depending on these choices that you make and the people that are in your life guiding you through those different decisions.
So let's look at it for this story. Now, this story is presented as Craig recalling his younger life, right? So what was that key moment, I think, is the first thing that we have to agree on. And I think there's two arguable options here. I think I may more strongly argue for it was when Craig decided to give the phone to Mr.
Is it more important than when he puts the phone in his pocket?
Okay, so here's why I would say it was giving the phone. And that's the first time in this story. You'll notice the character doesn't have much agency throughout this. Agency being when a character makes the plot move forward in a particular way. When Mr. Harrigan moves into town, you see that he's kind of hired by him. Is it okay, Dad? What story are we going to read? All these decisions are kind of being made by the other characters, right? Craig never really impacts the plot until the point when he finally gets money and the dad says, I ain't going to stop you. You do what you want with that money. That's the first time this character has any agency, where he gives the phone to Mr. Harrigan, and Mr. Harrigan's life changes drastically as a result of giving him that phone.
Yeah, I think that could be the very first one. I think that when he puts the phone in his pocket is more impactful to the story, though.
Well, I think it also is, why did it change Mr. Harrigan's life? He talks about how he was this big money mogul. Right?
Yeah.
I didn't care who I stepped on. I runned over whoever I want, and now I just want a peaceful life. It was very me, right? And here comes Craig when he buys him the phone. This is the first time someone's doing, I think, kind of like a more charitable act for Mr. Harrigan, that Mr. Harrigan starts to realize that he sees some redemption in these sorts of actions. And that's what Harrigan eventually starts to almost mimic. In terms of giving the gardener money, in terms of giving Craig money. That all spawned from that selfless act that Craig kind of started with giving him the phone, arguably.
So you're saying that Craig emulating Mr. Harrigan is the same as Mr. Harrigan emulating Craig?
Yeah, so I think you see a pass-off of personalities here, right? In terms of the influences that these characters clearly had on each other, like kind of like solidifies the bond that these two had.
Yeah, I like that.
Now, you'll notice now Mr. Harrigan then, like you said, in the same way that Craig's rubbed off on him, Mr. Harrigan starts to provide guidance to Craig in terms of these are the things that you need to look out for. Why do you think I selected this story? He doesn't give Craig the answer. He guides Craig to the answer. He's the Yoda to the hero Craig, Luke Skywalker, on this journey. Right?
Yeah, and helping him when he's a ghost too, a Force ghost.
So, and then we come into Kenny Yanko, where this is the first time our hero was first put to the test. And does he back down and allow himself to be trampled? No, he takes Mr. Harrigan's pride and self-respect and stands up to Kenny Yanko.
Won't do his shoes. Yeah. I'm not going to shine your shoes because there's no way Mr. Harrigan is going to be down here shining somebody's shoes.
All right. So soon Mr. Harrigan loses his corporal form. He becomes the hitman for hire, spirit angel, right? I think I have some quotes here that I think are kind of interesting. So Miss Hargensen, the double H's kind of bugs me. I wish he chose more different sounding names. So Miss Hargensen kind of steps in to help figure out Craig's next steps. Right, she's kind of guiding him, kind of offering him these opportunities. But again, just like once he took that step with giving the phone, he now has agency. He is now choosing whether to turn Kenny Yanko in or not. His power is now coming from this, right?
Yeah.
And she continues to play on these themes. She says, when they're talking about ghosts and such, she says, I suppose, but I'm still a good Catholic. That means I believe in God and the angels and the world of the spirit. I'm not so sure about exorcism and demonic possession. That seems pretty far out there. But ghosts, Let's just say the jury's out on that one. I'd certainly never attend a seance or mess with the Ouija board. Okay, Ouija board. What's an Ouija board, Crypto?
So this is a toy device that allowed you to communicate with the dead.
Right, so the Ouija board allows you to talk to the other side.
Yeah.
Right?
Which Craig is doing with his iPhone. Yeah.
Which Craig is doing with his iPhone, brought up by Miss Hargensen here. Right?
Yeah.
So what does an Ouija board summon?
Vengeful spirits.
It summons vengeful spirits, which what does his iPhone summon?
The vengeful spirit of Mr. Harrigan.
So we have another quote here from Miss Hargensen. She says, well, if ghosts exist, she said, I'll bet not all of them are holy.
Oh.
I thought that was funny, didn't you?
Yeah, I was like, oh, that was good. That's an important line. It almost seems like maybe it's a throwaway line, but I think it's super, super important.
It kind of reminds me of, remember that manga anime series that we saw, Death Note?
Oh, yeah.
The protagonist can play God by writing into this Death Note someone's name and how they will die, and then the person dies that way. And here our hero, Craig, has the iPhone note, right?
Yeah, he can pick up the iPhone note and make a call, and Mr. Harrigan's going to go kill this person for him.
So I'd say what we're really seeing at the core of the story for me, for what I pulled out of it, is we're starting to see this theme of we are the authors of our own lives and fates. And the investments we make with our time and relationships define us.
Ooh, that's good. That's deep.
Okay, so I know that, to me, that's a more important theme. We can't skip technology because you have to talk about technology. What do you want to talk about with technology?
So I think in technology, really, it's us and our connection with the world and how everything in the story revolves around technology binding us in some way or controlling us in some way. And I think that King is very, very, slapping you in the face with this. But I think he uses it to draw out some of these distinctions from other things in the story, right?
Yeah, I really like that one quote in terms of slapping me in the face. I kind of like getting slapped every now and then. We have him saying, Henry Thoreau said that we don't own things. Things own us. Every new object, whether it's a home, a car, a television, or a fancy phone like that one.
I think this takes us back to our buddy Dickens and Scrooge saying that the chains that we forge in life are something that matter in our afterlife. And I think the technology here that we use forges what we do in our lives. And I really like that in the story, Mr. Harrington says that it doesn't matter what we do. My name up on a building doesn't matter. It's going to be forgotten. Books are what matters. And I think that maybe it's a little bit self-serving here of Stephen King saying that, all this technology and Twitter and all those things don't matter. Books are what matter. Stories are what matter. And that's what will be remembered.
You're leading me right into it. I'm going to bite. But before we go there, I want to say you brought up something interesting about Dickens, and they did make that Dickens reference. I'm curious to ask first, when he first moved to town, I wrote down, how I take notes as I read, whenever something pops up, I wrote down that, is this going to be a Mr. Harrigan is Ebenezer Scrooge story?
Is it a redemption story?
Did you get that feeling from the beginning out of curiosity, or is it after he brought it up?
No, I think it was after he brought it up, but even overall, after the end of the story, I was like, it was not a redemption story for him. Right. It was, Craig's growth as a person of not becoming that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I was just kind of curious about that. Now, this is your fault. You led me here. I didn't know if I was going to go into this because people don't like it when you bring up issues or things that are problems. Now, these are just maybe not be issues for you. You're going to say, well, I really like this. And it's like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be looking at this from a literary perspective, okay? I love the story. I really do. But that doesn't mean I can't admit that there's faults too. And here's some things that are more about Stephen King that are exhibited in this story that I think, in my opinion, hold him back from a literary standpoint. He's Stephen King. He can do whatever he wants. He doesn't care about this. I do. And these are things that are kind of issues for me. Why do you read, Crypto, first of all?
I read to better myself. I read to find out new things about myself, to understand myself better, to understand the world better, other people better. And this story has some faults that I think I see where you're going.
So I agree. I read because I want to be asked questions. I want to recognize, learn things about myself, learn things about humanity, and kind of dig deeper for truth, right? What is this human experience that we're all going through? And the problem for me is that when a writer tries to inject their views. Like, you're going to have views no matter what. Like, you can't be 100% neutral. But there's very clearly things that he injects into his stories that kind of irk me a little bit, where he's like trying to guide you a specific way. Like one that I wrote down that you see all the time is that you know that he's super liberal, right? Which is totally cool. And I think they're actually really funny when he puts these in. But he wrote, from Dad, "I'm not a Bush fan. He's a bit of a fool," Mr. Harrigan agreed, which begins some political commentary, which we saw used like extremely heavy-handed. If you haven't seen our Gwendy's button box discussion, that's all that story was about, right? Like, that's why that story was written, right?
No, he's taking small jabs at political people, and it doesn't add anything to the story.
Well, it's funny to me. I do like that. I'm not saying he has to take it out, but by putting that in here, that is taking away some of the value of books presenting questions or making you look internal. This is making you think a specific way because he is so liberal. He's injecting that into this. But there's another point I wrote down here where he said, "A reader is a carrier, not a creator." And that one particularly kind of rubs me interestingly, because while you and I do believe in authorial intent, if you didn't know, is that whatever the author says he meant is in stone and you can't change it. A lot of criticism came to more of an awakening to realize that it's more along the lines of the reader's interpretation, right? Things might mean different to us as readers that maybe the author didn't intend, but that doesn't change the emotions or the reactions or realizations that we have internal. And this is very clearly a line kind of commenting on that, which kind of irked me a little bit to say that the reader is a carrier and not a creator, that he's saying that it is authorial intent. What the author puts in here is what it's supposed to be. You can't just make it whatever you want. Lines like this are what keep him from being really good literature and just kind of a fun, more... He has literary elements to it, but he is more of a genre fictionalist writer because of these sort of things.
Yeah, you can take very easy offense to this as a reader, because if you don't ally with him politically or religiously or whatever, that's going to, upset you internally a little bit, and then maybe you don't enjoy the story as much. But a line like that is insulting as well. Very simply, we can disprove a line like that. What does Craig look like to you, Una?
Craig? I don't know. He looks like a young boy. Raspy hair, average looking. Why?
Now, see, I pictured him as having a nice tight comb over, his face always clean. He always had his shirt tucked in, a little belt. We had two very different images of what Craig looked like. We created those images. Stephen King didn't give that to us. So it's something that simple is you create a lot of these things. What did his voice sound like?
Craig was what was his name? Joel Osment. What was Haley Joel Osment? Was that his name?
Yeah.
That was Craig for me.
Yeah. See, and he looked nothing like that to me. So no, I completely disagree with that we are not just the carriers of this, and we are part of the creation too.
Well, okay. And I know some people say, hey, I don't care about that thing. That's great. And people might say, like, well, I think he was using it ironically. That's great. These are just things that when he injects the things like the constant liberal things, I think they're funny and I like them and I don't have a problem with them. But they are the reason why he cannot be taken seriously in a lot of literary circles, which is what we tend to focus on. Right?
Yeah, and again, just our opinions, and we're going very deep here into a literary breakdown of what is probably meant to be more of a fun story than something we traditionally, break down on this channel.
All right, we're getting subjective enough. Let's move into our subjective ratings. So we had kind of like the interpretation, some meetings and discussions about that. Let's move more to the subjective side with how did this story hit us? Crypto, why don't you go first?
I'm going to give this a solid 7.
Okay.
Really, really enjoyed it. I liked kind of the twist towards the end, and I liked how we got out some different views on here. Not his best work. Definitely he's had worse. And I'm kind of comparing that number within just Stephen King's short stories. Because this is, I don't want to say a throwaway, but this is for more fun. This is brain candy, right? This is not Tolstoy to me. This is not Vonnegut to me. Okay.
Yeah, I think I might have had a more positive experience with this. Just overall, I enjoyed my time reading it. I agree, maybe it's not maybe the most important piece that I would point to people to go study, but just on a personal, I really enjoyed the story. I liked it. It was really fun, very easy page turner to kind of move through. I'm going to go with an 8 on the subjective scale of ratings.
I think my main problem with it, besides all the stuff we already talked about, was there was no Stephen King twist at the end.
You wanted the twist, huh?
Well, it's kind of, I guess I've come to expect it, and that's more my problem than his, so maybe I shouldn't be so harsh.
All right, guys, thank you so much for checking it out. If you enjoy these literary discussions, we are going to be going through the rest of these books as well. We're going to be going in order in terms of 2, 3, 4. Maybe switching 3 or 4, just depending on the timing of how long it takes us to get through some of those. So please consider subscribing so you can check out the rest of these discussions. Ona out.
Peace. I just got a sticker in the butt. Oh, stupid dogs.
My bum is on my lips. My bum is on my lips.
I might be bleeding. No pun intended.